In this video, we'll examine every execution carried out in the United States during the month of May. We will look into their cases, last meals requests, and final words. Jeffrey Hutchinson, executed by lethal injection on May 1st, 2025 in the state of Florida. On the night of September 11th, 1998, in the panhandle town of Crestview, Florida, Jeffrey Hutchinson had an argument with his girlfriend, Renee Flaherty. Angrily, he packed some clothes and guns into his truck and drove to a bar. While he was drinking, he told the staff about his argument with Flaherty before abruptly leaving. What happened next turned a family home into a crime scene. About 40 minutes later, a 911 call was placed from Hutchinson's home. A male voice said, "I just shot my family." Within 10 minutes of the call, police arrived to find Flaherty, 32, and her 3 young children, Jeffrey, 9, Amanda, 7, and Logan, 4, dead from shotgun wounds. Hutchinson was found sitting in the garage with a phone in his hand, still connected to the 911 operator. The murder weapon, a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun, was located on the kitchen counter, and police reported gunshot residue on Hutchinson's hands. At his 2001 trial, Hutchinson claimed the murders were carried out by 2 unknown men acting under a U.S. government plot to silence him. He cited his public statements about Gulf War illnesses among veterans, as well as his prior service in the U.S. Army, including time as an elite ranger. The jury found him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison for Flaherty's killing and received 3 death sentences for the murders of the children. His final meal included salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, a baked potato, and iced tea. He gave no final statement, though witnesses say he appeared to mumble to himself as the injection began shortly before 8 p.m. Hutchinson, 62, spent 27 years on death row and was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. following a lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. Glenn Edward Rogers, executed by lethal injection on May 15, 2025, in the state of Florida. Glenn Edward Rogers, known by the press as both the Casanova Killer and the Cross-Country Killer, left a trail of violent crimes across multiple states in the mid-1990s. On the night of September 28, 1995, in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles, Rogers met Sandra Gallagher at a local bar. The two spent time together, playing pool and drinking, before Gallagher agreed to give him a ride. She likely thought it was a harmless favor, but it was a decision that would cost her life. The next morning, her body was discovered in her burning truck. She had been strangled and set on fire. Rogers fled the state and surfaced in Mississippi. In October, at the 1995 Mississippi State Fair, he met Linda Price, a 34-year-old mother of 2. The two began dating, but just days later, on November 3rd, Price was found stabbed to death in the bathtub of her Jackson apartment. On November 7th, Rogers arrived in Tampa, Florida. He checked into the Tampa 8 Inn and visited the nearby Showtown USA bar and restaurant, where he was seen dancing and buying a round of drinks for a group of women. Among them was Tina Cribbs, who agreed to give Rogers a ride to a nearby carnival lot. She left her beer on the bar, saying she'd be back. She never returned. 2 days later, Cribbs was found dead in the bathtub of room 119, the room Rogers had rented. She had been stabbed twice with a long knife. Authorities believe Rogers traveled to Bossier City, Louisiana, where he met Andy Lou Giles Sutton, a mother of 4. After convincing her to let him stay, Rogers left briefly. Few could have predicted his next destination. He took the bus to Tampa, Florida, before driving back in a car that was registered to Tina Cribbs. Sutton was later found stabbed to death in her bed on November 9, 1995. Rogers was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list and was captured in Kentucky driving Cribb's car following one of the nation's first widely televised police chases. Following his arrest, Rogers claimed responsibility for the 1994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, as well as more than 70 other victims. No credible evidence supported those claims. Rogers was convicted in Florida for the murders of Sandra Gallagher and Tina Cribbs. Prosecutors in Louisiana and Mississippi declined to pursue charges, citing Florida's death sentence as sufficient. On the day of his execution, he requested a last meal of pizza, chocolate cake, and a soda. But what came next caught nearly everyone off guard. In his final statement, he addressed the victims' families and U.S. President Donald Trump. "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure. President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." Rogers, 61, spent 28 years on death row and was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m., following a lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Matthew Johnson, executed by lethal injection on May 20th, 2025, in the state of Texas. Johnson was convicted for the murder of 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris in May 2012 in the Dallas suburb of Garland. On the morning of May 20th, 2012, Harris was working as a clerk at the Fina Whip-In convenience store in Garland. What seemed an ordinary day quickly changed after Johnson entered the store and walked behind the counter. What he did next would leave the community in shock. He forced Harris to open the register, then poured lighter fluid over her head. Before she could react, he grabbed 2 lighters from a display, 2 packs of cigarettes, and removed a ring from her finger. Once Harris opened the cash drawer, Johnson took the money, then lit her on fire. Engulfed in flames, Harris ran to a nearby sink, trying to put out the fire. At the same time, Johnson calmly walked out of the store, stopping to grab a piece of candy on his way out. Unable to put out the fire, Harris stumbled outside, screaming for help. Police officers, a firefighter, and a paramedic responded. They were able to extinguish the flames and rushed her to the hospital by ambulance. Harris had 2nd to 4th degree burns on over 40% of her body, including her face, arms, chest, and legs. Johnson fled into the neighborhood behind the store, shedding his clothing as he ran. When police finally caught him later that morning, he reportedly said, "What took you so long? Y'all are getting slow." 5 days later, Nancy Harris was taken off life support. She passed away on May 25, 2012. She left behind 4 sons. At trial, Johnson testified that he had been high on drugs and claimed he never meant to kill Harris, only to scare her. He expressed remorse for his actions. The defense presented testimony about Johnson's long history of drug addiction, which began when he was a child. They also introduced evidence of childhood sexual abuse. An expert on addiction testified that Johnson was likely under the influence at the time of the crime. But the jury didn't accept his defense. On November 8, 2013, Johnson was sentenced to death. The verdict was unanimous. For his final meal, Johnson was served fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and a slice of apple pie. In his final statement, he addressed Harris's family. "To Mrs. Harris's family, as I look at each and every one of you, I see her on that day. I just please ask for y'all's forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her. I pray that she's the first person that I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her." Johnson, 50, spent 13 years on death row and was pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. following a lethal injection in the state of Texas. Benjamin Ritchie. Executed by lethal injection on May 20th, 2025 in the state of Indiana. September 29, 2000, Beech Grove, Indiana. It started as a routine morning until 3 men stole a white van from a local gas station. One of them was 20-year-old Benjamin Ritchie. The theft was quickly reported to police. Just 2 hours later, Officer Matt Hickey spotted the stolen van while on his way to a traffic accident call. After confirming the plate number over the radio, he began to follow. Soon, 2 more officers, Robert Mercury and William Toney, joined the pursuit. Inside the van were now just 2 of the original suspects, Ritchie and 20-year-old Michael Greer. The chase didn't last long. The van pulled into the yard of a quiet residential home. Both men jumped out and ran in opposite directions. Officer Hickey caught Greer and placed him under arrest. Officer Toney ran after Ritchie. What happened next would end in tragedy. During the foot chase, Ritchie drew a handgun and opened fire. Officer Toney was hit 4 times. One of the bullets entered just above his protective vest, killing him. He was 31 years old and had served on the force for only 2 years. By the next day, Ritchie was found hiding at the home of a friend, Michael Moody, who had been involved in the initial van theft. In 2002, a jury found Ritchie guilty of murder and multiple other charges. He was sentenced to death. Since then, Ritchie has spent years trying to overturn the conviction in both state and federal courts, but every attempt has failed. In his final appeal, Ritchie claimed that his trial attorney had failed to present critical evidence. He argued that he may have suffered from fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and childhood exposure to lead, both known to impair brain development. He also asked the court to consider his age at the time of the shooting. He was just 20 years old, but the court wasn't convinced. On the day of his execution, Ritchie requested a final meal from Olive Garden, the Tour of Italy combo, which included chicken parmigiana, lasagna classico, and fettuccine alfredo. In his final statement, he said, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." Ritchie, 45, spent 23 years on death row. He was pronounced dead at 1:46 a.m., following a lethal injection in the state of Indiana. Oscar Franklin Smith. Executed by lethal injection on May 22, 2025, in the state of Tennessee. It was the night of October 1st, 1989. A 911 dispatcher answered a chilling call. 13-year-old Jason Burnett could be heard screaming, "Help me!" In the background, the muffled voice of his brother cried out, "Frank, no, God help me." Following the call, police officers were dispatched to the home. What they concluded next left many stunned. They reported seeing nothing unusual and chalked the call up to a false alarm, unaware that inside, 35-year-old Judith Robert Smith and her sons 13-year-old Jason Burnett and 16-year-old Chad Burnett had already been brutally murdered. Their bodies wouldn't be discovered until 15 hours later, when an 8-year-old relative came to the house and found the unimaginable. All 3 victims had their throats slashed from ear to ear. Judith had also been stabbed repeatedly and shot in the neck and arm. Chad was stabbed several times and shot through his chest, shoulder, and left eye. At the time of the killings, Oscar Franklin Smith was Judith's estranged husband. The two shared 3-year-old twins, and Judith's sons were from a previous marriage. Co-workers of Judith later testified that Smith had repeatedly threatened to kill Judith, at least a dozen times, between June and August of that year. One even recalled Smith saying he'd kill the boys because Judy treated them better than the twins. The day after the murders, Smith was questioned by the police. They noted that he showed no emotion when told his wife and her sons had been murdered. a reaction that raised red flags. A partial bloody palm print found at the scene linked him to the crime. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, his execution date was set and delayed multiple times, but in 2025 the sentence was carried out. For his last meal, Smith requested hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. In his final words, he turned his attention to the justice system and to Tennessee Governor Bill Lee. "Somebody needs to tell the governor the justice system doesn't work," Smith said. "He's the last word and the last person to give justice where justice is needed. Too many innocent people are being killed." As the drugs began to take effect, Smith kept repeating his final claim: "I didn't kill her. I didn't kill her." Oscar Franklin Smith, 75, spent nearly 35 years on death row and was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. following a lethal injection in the state of Tennessee.